Welcome. My name is Martin Tang, class of 1972, and I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Erik Brynjolfsson. Erik is the Schussel Family Professor of Management Science, a professor of information technology, and the director of the MIT Center for Digital Business at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Professor Brynjolfsson explores how advances in information technology contribute to business performance and organizational change. He directs the MIT Center for Digital Business, a research initiative that analyzes the business uses of the internet and other digital technologies. His projects include a study of information worker productivity, evaluation method for intangible organizational capital, calibrations of increased product variety online, also known as the long tail, and an analysis of optimal pricing strategies for digital goods. In a related work, he is assessing how investments in computers and networks alter economic growth, industry structure, and labor demand. He holds an AB in Applied Mathematics from Harvard College, an SM in Decision Sciences from Harvard University, and a PhD in Managerial Economics from MIT. And I guess I'm supposed to make that dig about things are getting better. Erik is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, The Second Machine Age, which he will discuss today. Please join me in welcoming Erik Brynjolfsson.
Thank you, Martin. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for what you and your family have done, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm really delighted that there are so many people coming out on a sunny Saturday morning, early in the morning, just to learn, which is great about the Sloan School and the kind of students and alumni we have, that there really is a love of learning, and I'll try and contribute to that a little bit. When we started the Center for Digital Business first, and then now this new initiative on the digital economy, which you'll hear about a little bit more towards the end of my talk, we understood very early that the best way to understand how these digital technologies were transforming the world was not to try to retreat to our offices and close the doors and windows and think deep thoughts about how digitization and networks were changing the world, but rather to get out and interact with our students and with alumni and with company executives all over the world and hear about the challenges and opportunities they're facing. And that's part of what I want to do today. I'm going to share with you the research that we've been doing with our team at the Initiative on the Digital Economy, and particularly my co-author, Andrew McAfee, that's co-directing this initiative. But I also want to hear from you about what you're seeing out there. So we're going to have some Q&A and some discussion, and so feel free to think of some of the issues that you'd like to have discussed further, and we'll have a chance to talk about those things. But let me start by talking about some of the ways that the world is changing and the big issues that I see coming forward. There's a wave of new technologies driven by Moore's Law and the exponential improvements in that. Computers are getting better, faster than anything else ever. A child's PlayStation today is more powerful than a supercomputer, a military supercomputer from the late 1990s. Networking is connecting the world's billions. We've got Bob Metcalf sitting here in front of me, who helped, one of our fellow alumni, who helped develop the key networking technologies that are now connecting billions of people together across the planet, giving them access to the world's information, but also allowing them all to contribute to that store of information. And we have new combinations of goods and services that can be combined and recombined to create additional innovations. All these forces put together are fundamentally transforming the way the economy works. And we've had some big disruption over the past 10 years. But I'm confident that over the next 10 years, we're going to face some even bigger opportunities and even bigger challenges as the technologies continue to accelerate. To put this in a little bit of context, let's think about what it takes to change the world. Who here would like to have the power to change the world? Anybody? Okay. All right. You got, that's my class. That's good. So I like to see that. what does it take to change the world? Well, there's different perspectives on that. Margaret Mead famously said that what it takes to change the world is a small group of committed people. Steve Jobs had the perspective that an insanely great vision could change the world. But we're back at MIT, so I'm going to take a little bit more of an engineering perspective, a little bit more of a wonkish perspective on what it takes to change the world. I'm going to argue that to change the world, it really takes two things. It takes physical power and mental power. It takes a power system, and it takes a control system. You need a power system because the world is made mostly out of atoms, and those atoms are held in force by powerful laws of physics that you learned about in some of your classes, like gravity and electromagnetism. And to change the world in a very literal sense, you need to be able to move atoms. You need to be able to rearrange things. You need physical power to change the world. But you also need mental power. You need a control system that tells you where to put those things, how to arrange them, how to organize them. So if you're an engineer, you want to have a good power system and a good control system. I want to make the case that the Industrial Revolution was mostly about making huge advances in our power system. If you look over the sweep of history for centuries or millennia, and if you look at it from an economist's perspective, what you see is that although there were revolutions and empires, there were wars, there were great philosophers, there were religions, there were huge changes in the history books, from an economic perspective, living standards barely budged. For centuries, for millennia, there was barely any change in living standards up until about 1790. And in 1790, the steam engine was widely used, began to be widely used. Thomas Watt invented a much more effective way of using the steam engine, about 30% more effective than the previous ones, which is enough to create a tipping point where it started being widely used. And that new technology set off the Industrial Revolution. And ever since then, living standards have been growing exponentially, and we are dozens of times wealthier and richer than our ancestors that lived 200 years ago, mainly because of that technology and the subsequent technologies of the Industrial Revolution, the internal combustion engine, electricity. And I want to argue that most of those provided a better power system. They automated and augmented human muscle and animal muscle with technologies that allowed us to move things around, rearrange the world more effectively. So that's the power system. The perspective that Andy and I are making the case for is that we are now in the early stages of a second machine age. This second machine age has some similarities to the Industrial Revolution, but it also has some differences. It's really much more about what I was calling the control system than the power system. It's about augmenting and automating mental power. So the technologies of computer, software, data, networks, machine intelligence, these are allowing us to understand better how to rearrange things, and in many cases allowing machines to make the kinds of decisions that humans used to previously make. And there are some early examples of this decades ago, but it's particularly picked up pace in the past 10 years with some tremendous advances in machine intelligence, which I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes. But I also want to foreshadow another component of this, which is how these technologies are not just increasing our power to change the world and allowing us to really, literally transform the way we live, but also affecting the relationship between humans and machines. In the first machine age, if you have a better power system, you still need that control system. A locomotive needs an engineer, a car needs a driver, a factory needs someone to figure out how to arrange things. So as the power system got better and better, the value of human labor went up. Wages went up. And we all paid workers more and more over that period of time. In the second machine age, it's not as obvious whether or not humans will be complements or substitutes. In some cases, they're complements in the sense that they become more valuable as machines could automate tasks. But in other cases, they have become less valuable as machines substitute for them. and that puts downward pressure on wages and employment. And I'll talk more about the implications of that and what some of the data say about what's been happening over the past 15 or 20 years and accelerating in the past 5 or 10 years. But let's dive in a little bit further first into some of the technology and discuss how that's evolving. So this is an anniversary, so I went back and looked at what we were doing 10 years ago. I was teaching a class about what machines could do well and what humans could do well. And I used, in part, this book by Frank Levy, a fellow MIT professor, and Dick Murnane over at another school up the river. And it was a terrific book, very useful. And in my class, we had a discussion. We basically came up with 3 big categories that humans have a big edge in. One was actually just basic mobility and fine motor control, like being able to pick up this clicker here, or even harder, picking up a dime off of the podium. That would be something that would be very difficult for a machine to do, or walking around in a crowded room, any kind of mobility. Language and complex communication was another thing we decided was mostly human, almost uniquely human, whether it's just speech or writing and generating text. And then pattern matching and unstructured problem solving. We were ready to concede structured problem solving, doing big calculations. Okay, machines are good at that. But when it comes to recognizing subtle patterns or unstructured problem solving, we as a group decided that was something humans had an edge in. And these were mapped very much with what was said in this book. It was a terrific book written in 2004. The example that they gave in the book and that we thought was appropriate that brought together many of these skills was driving a car through heavy traffic, something that we just couldn't imagine a machine being able to do. Well, I see some of you smiling and giggling over there because you know that the professor was wrong. That was not an accurate forecast of what was going on. I underestimated what the technology could do, and in fairness, so did my whole class, and so did this book, because things have happened faster than we expected. Here's a picture of Andy and me grinning like idiots because we just survived a ride down Route 101 in a driverless car. And this was in response to the DARPA Grand Challenge, which challenged technologists at MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, all over the world to create a driverless car. And the first versions of it actually started in 2004, and they were terrible. Half of them didn't even make it out of the starting gate. Some of them literally flipped over as they tried to navigate the course. But each year they got a little bit better, and ultimately Google and its team, drawing particularly on Sebastian Thrun's work, were able to create these self-driving cars. Andy and I rode down Route 101 in this car back in 2012. Actually, I'll tell you a little bit about my experience with the self-driving car, because it was kind of fun. They wouldn't let me take pictures of the inside. I guess it's all kind of top secret. But you can see some of it there on the outside. There's a little LiDAR on the top of it that's light-based radar that helps navigate things. It also has regular radar in the front of the car up there, and a bunch of other little devices. A bunch of computer power, GPS. As we were riding down Route 101, we went from Mountain View up to San Francisco and back again. Probably many of you have ridden that ride. And you probably know that if you go there on a sunny afternoon, 2 o'clock, it's quite possible that the road will come to a complete stop. In fact, that's what happened to us. There was so much traffic that the car in front of us just stopped right in the middle of the highway. And we were cruising along, and I was sort of sitting there in the back seat, hoping that this driverless car recognized that there was a stopped car right in front of us. And I have to admit, I kind of grabbed the seat a little tighter. But it came to a very smooth, comfortable stop, and that's why I'm here to speak to all of you today. And it continued, stop and go traffic. And then the traffic started flowing a little better, and we were soon going 55 miles per hour. And that kind of fear gave way to a second emotion, which I'd have to say was something more like exhilaration. It's a little embarrassing, but I do remember Andy and I kind of sticking our hands out the windows and waving at the car. Hey guys, we're in a self-driving car, check it out. That was fun. We did that at maybe 5, 10, okay, maybe 15 minutes. But after a while, that got boring too. And then the third emotion that we had, which was really most of the ride, because it took like 2 hours to go up there and back again, was really something more like, I guess you have to say boredom. We were just sitting there, and the car is riding along at 55 miles per hour. It doesn't break the speed limit. Somebody programmed it to follow the laws. And there was like no slaloming or swerving or anything really cool. It was just sort of driving along really quietly along the highway there. And after a while, if you trust the car, it's really just not that exciting anymore. And so those three emotions, from fear, exhilaration, to ultimately kind of boredom, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people end up having the same experiences, not just with the self-driving car, but with more of these technologies. I mean, probably, I don't really remember, but when the microwave oven was invented and introduced, maybe people had the same kind of emotions. Most of us think of their pretty boring piece of technology, but I guess at one time those were kind of magical. So this will, I think, reflect the way we adapt to the technology and understand it. Society, it'll take a little bit longer. But I want to talk, the self-driving car is one example of how the technology rushed ahead a little faster than we expected, but it's not the only one. And let me go back to those three categories: interacting with the physical world, language, and problem solving. And I want to make the case that in the past 10 years, we've had some huge advances in each of those categories that really put to shame what we tried to predict as recently as 2004. And I want to make the argument that collectively, we, those of us in this room, and really those of us on this planet, are in the midst of a huge one-time event that is transforming the world, where we're going from a world where machines really can't do all those kinds of mental tasks to one where they can, and it has profound implications for the growth of the economy, for the division of income in the economy, for the way we organize work, and for some of our economic institutions, at least as profound as the Industrial Revolution that transformed the lives of our ancestors. So, interacting with the physical world. Rod Brooks, fellow professor at MIT, used to head the computer science and AI lab. I guess now he's technically a professor emeritus because he's spending most of his time at a company called Rethink Robotics. Before that, he founded iRobot. Some of you may have some of his robots, including the little Roombas that he sold. Also a lot of military computers. I hope too many of you don't have those robots. This is Baxter. Baxter is a robot that he sells now for a little over $20,000. Andy and I got to work with Baxter a bit. And Baxter's amazing. It can do a lot of simple tasks, like here it's taking stuff out of a box and putting it on an assembly line. This is a job that millions of people are doing all over the world, including here in Massachusetts. I wasn't aware of this, but there's some factories where people are doing this exact job in Massachusetts. But Baxter can do the job just fine, and Baxter can work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Rod figures out that the fully loaded cost of Baxter is a little less than $4 an hour. Well, that's what he told me a little while ago, and then I got an email last week about how they have version 2.0 of the software that drives Baxter, which is twice as fast and twice as efficient, so maybe that changes those numbers a little bit to make it even more cost effective. Baxter doesn't require special programming. You don't have to write code to teach Baxter how to do things. It's kind of very simple. When you take it out of the box, within an hour or two, you can set it up and have it running. And the way you teach Baxter how to do things is you just grab its arm and you kind of move it and say, here, pick this up, put a button, and then you say, put it over there. It's got cameras in the arm. And if you do that a couple of times, it learns what it's supposed to do, and it adapts on the fly to be doing that. So, ordinary factory workers, without having gotten PhDs at MIT or anywhere, are able to work with Baxter quite easily. And so he's selling a lot of these in the United States, in Asia, elsewhere. He's hoping to bring a lot of manufacturing back to the United States. So that's a robot that is affecting a lot of work right now, creating a lot of value, but also rearranging that value. This is another robot, one that I got to visit. This guy's name is Atlas. He looks a little more intimidating. Atlas, they have one of them here at the Computer Science and AI Lab, is a robot that's built in response to the new DARPA Robotics Challenge. The last one was the self-driving car. This one, the DARPA Robotics Challenge, is a little different. What Atlas is supposed to do is to go up to a vehicle, get inside of it, sit down, grab the steering wheel, put his foot on the gas pedal, and drive the vehicle. So it's a kind of a different self-driving car. I say vehicle because the vehicles they have for this are a little bit more like glorified golf carts, but you kind of get the idea. After Atlas drives it a short distance, Atlas gets out, goes up to a door, opens a door, which actually turns out to be kind of tricky to do, goes through the door, walks across a rubble-strewn field of like cinder blocks. It's very uneven. Reaches down, picks up a hose, attaches a nozzle to it, goes over, turns a lever and some gears on a wall, goes up a step ladder. So a whole set of tasks like that. As you can see, they're meant to mimic what a human does in different kinds of situations. Specifically, the mock-up for Atlas is the Fukushima nuclear plant, where they had some real problems, but they couldn't go into it because it had so much radiation, and they wished they had some kind of machine device that could go in and take care of things, somebody who was immune to radiation, like Atlas would be. I want to be clear, Atlas does not yet do all those things that I just described. That's the challenge. But we met with Gil Pratt. He came up here to MIT. He's the head of the DARPA Robotics Challenge. By the way, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the United States. And he says people are way ahead of what he expected. In fact, the leading team, there's teams from all over the world, the leading team is from Japan. The team from MIT did very well, I'm happy to say. Seth Teller here is one of the guys running that. And you can imagine if they're able to successfully do all these tasks, there are a lot of jobs that will be affected in lots of different categories, lots of opportunities to have machines do all sorts of work that previously only humans could do. What about language? Well, it used to be kind of science fiction that you'd watch on Star Trek when they would talk to their machines and the machines would understand and speak back and carry out their instructions. It wasn't that long ago that was something you only saw, Captain Kirk doing or whatever. But today, most of us routinely do that, right? We have our little devices and we talk to them and expect them to carry out simple instructions. They're a little uneven, they're not great, but I think we're in the middle of about a 10 to 15-year time period where we're going from humans not talking to machines to humans routinely talking to machines and just expecting them to understand what we say and expecting them to carry out our instructions when we tell them what to do and maybe answer back and give us other information and clarification. That's kind of a wondrous event when you think about it. In the sweep of human history, people will look back at our generation and say, wow, they were the ones that went from not being able to talk to machines to having machines understand what they're saying. We also have machines doing amazing translation. Rick Rashid of Microsoft gave a talk in China recently. As he spoke in English, it was simultaneously translated into Chinese. Not by human translators, but by machines. And the way the technology works, this year we'll all be able to do the same thing because they are building into Skype that same technology. So when you make a phone call or a video call on Skype, free software, you can speak in one language, and they say by the end of 2014, they'll have it rolled out where you'll be able to have people on the other end understand you in German or other languages. So that's kind of an amazing change there. And perhaps the most striking one is the last one there, what's happening in terms of being able to not just understand text and translate it, but be able to generate it. So here's a news story about the world champion Red Sox. I know they lost their game last night, but we have hope that they will repeat again. And I don't know if any of you are going to get to see a Red Sox game while you're here in town. It's, if you read the story, there's nothing really that exciting about this particular story. It's sort of the usual sports story, some statistics. It's kind of a little more wonkish. It's kind of got these interesting stats in there. But the most interesting part of this story is actually the byline. I don't know if you can read that. The byline is by somebody with the name of Automated Insights. Interesting name, and that's because it's not a human. A machine wrote this story. And if you go to Yahoo and kind of look at some of the bylines, what you'll see is that many of the sports stories are now being written by machines. And not just sports stories about professional teams, but college teams, tens of thousands of high school teams have their stories written now by Automated Insights and other companies like Narrative Science in local newspapers all over the world. They're not really sophisticated, dramatic narratives, but they basically summarize what happened based on the box score. You feed in some statistics, and it generates a news story out of it. And it's not just sports. You're seeing it in business as well. This story was written by somebody named Narrative Science, another company. And if you go to Forbes, look at them, look at the bylines, you'll start seeing more and more robots, more and more machines writing things that used to be written by humans. They're not yet at the level of a master's thesis at the MIT Sloan School, but they are creeping up a little bit in the ladder. And thirdly, let me touch on problem solving, which I think is the most striking of all and the one that has the most potential to transform the world, answering unstructured questions and pattern recognition. My favorite example of that is actually the game show Jeopardy! I think most of you are familiar with this game. It has these sort of bizarre questions, like here's one of them. Sometimes it's hard even to understand what the question is. You can read that and try and figure out what the answer is. But it could be about literature, it could be about sports, science, current events, history. You know, there are all sorts of possibilities. It draws on really most of human knowledge. And there are humans who play this game, like Ken Jennings up there on the left. Ken Jennings won the game show Jeopardy! 75 times in a row. There were actually rumors that he was genetically engineered from birth to play Jeopardy! I don't think that's true, but he was very, very good. Brad Rutter on the other side was the person who ultimately beat Ken Jennings. In the middle, there's IBM's Watson supercomputer, which Dave Ferrucci and his team built specifically to play the game show Jeopardy! So I invited Dave Ferrucci to come speak to my class at MIT, my Sloan School class, and he showed me the most remarkable chart, this chart, and he let me share this with you. It took some arm twisting, but he let me. And this chart is the data they gathered from all of the humans who played and won Jeopardy! These are all the human Jeopardy! Champions. And that's what those little blue dots that look like mosquitoes up there at the top, those are humans, the best of humans. And as you can see, they're quite good in terms of how well they play the game. Their accuracy is 70, 80, 90, even 100%. That means they got almost all the questions correct. And they're fairly aggressive. Many of them answered over 50% of the questions in any given game. So that's how humans were doing. So Dave showed me how Watson did when they first created it. It wasn't so good. Watson got less than 50% of the questions, more like 20%. Watson is a line, not a dot. Why is that? Because he has a little dial on Watson, and he can turn it to be more aggressive or less aggressive. Watson could try to answer all the questions, or it could just focus on the ones where it seems to be confident, although it doesn't always really know what it knows, and it gets that a little bit wrong. But you can see that there's sort of a range of success, not anywhere close to human level, when they first created it back in 2006. But Watson had a characteristic that no humans had, and that was the ability for it to improve at a just remarkable rate as they kept adding computer processing power, they kept adding more data, they had Watson read all of Wikipedia. By the way, Watson's not allowed to be connected to the internet when it plays, just like us. It has to just rely on what it has in its brain. But it read Wikipedia. At one point, they had Watson read the Urban Dictionary online and all the information there. You're laughing because I think you probably know that if you read the Urban Dictionary, you got to be careful. They had to stop that because after reading the Urban Dictionary the next day, Watson started using swear words in its answers. So they erased that part of his memory and said, you know what, just don't use those facts. Watson's young. It's kind of like a child. You have to supervise it when it surfs the internet. But Watson learned quite rapidly, and what we saw was that every few months they came out with another version of Watson that was significantly better, and it was almost scary how rapidly it was improving. And by the time he showed this to my class, you could see that Watson was already better than most human Jeopardy! Champions. And a few months later, it was only a few months later, that they went ahead and played against Ken Jennings on national TV. And as you probably know, Watson totally destroyed Ken Jennings. In fact, got 3 times as much, got more than Ken and Brad put together, did super well. But I thought that was one challenge. You know, Ken Jennings and Brad are pretty smart. But I said, why don't you come to MIT and play some of our students? So I had Watson come and play against a team of MIT students, 3 of us, three of them that worked together. And also, to make it interesting, we had a team of Harvard students. So we had some guys from Harvard Business School. So we had 3 teams, MIT, Harvard, and Watson. And we played it We actually did it over at Burden Auditorium. They have a bigger classroom. I guess their alumni have been able to donate a very large classroom over there. We had this, it was like 700 people there, and we were all cheering. It was a lot of fun. And it was amazing, because we'd go back and forth. At various times, the humans were leading. But once again, by the end of it, the Watson did win and had the most score. We did a little better than Brad and Ken did. Watson came in first place. I'm not going to tell you who came in a dismal third place and apparently didn't study sports very well. True to their stereotype. There was this question about, it was actually the home team. We got lucky. It was a daily double about the home team Boston Celtics and their starting lineup. And apparently that's not covered in any of the MIT courses. So. Ken Jennings actually had a pretty good sense of humor when he lost against it, as we tried to have a good sense of humor. He got the correct answer in the final question, but he also added the parenthetical, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords." So that was his approach. But that was kind of fun in games, Watson. But IBM didn't build Watson just so they could win $77,000 on Jeopardy. But probably didn't hurt. But what they were most interested in was using this in other applications. So I've been talking a lot to the team. We're going to have them work with some of our MIT Sloan students in the fall. And they have verticals that are focusing in different areas, like call centers. What is a call center? But it's basically a question answering system. You call in, they want to hook up Watson to something like Siri, a voice recognition, and now when you call in, it could answer a broad set of different questions. They're doing legal questions, legal advice, document discovery and analysis, investment advice and banking advice. They're doing medical diagnosis. If Dr. Watson is not today the best diagnostician in the world, I think Dr. Watson will be within 5 years. Watson has read all the medical literature. The guys at IBM said it would take about 160 hours a week for the typical human specialist just to read that week's new findings in the medical literature. A little hard to do for a human, but Watson has no problem keeping up with all of that. And you may choose in 5 years to go to Dr. Watson for a second opinion after your doctor diagnoses you. Or maybe you'll start going to Dr. Watson for a first opinion. And there are other technologies that are having similar amazing breakthroughs in medicine. We also see that you may soon be hired and fired by a machine for your other jobs. I'm advising a company called NAC, and NAC has some very accurate software that helps assess people's strengths and fit and match them up to jobs where they're likely to do well. In fact, we've done a series of tests where we compare the recommendations of NAC to the recommendations of human HR managers based on face-to-face interviews. And NAC, by and large, significantly outperforms the humans in terms of recommending where people will be most successful and which people from the applicant pool will be most successful. It does this by having people, basically you play these simple video games and it kind of tracks information from which it can infer your creativity, your persistence, your extroversion, and other characteristics. So what does all this mean for the economy? I could go on with lots more amazing examples. It's one of the fun things about being at MIT is I get to hang around with these technologists at CSAIL, the Media Lab, our friends out in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, many of which are MIT graduates. But I'm mainly an economist, and I've been thinking about what this means for the economy. And I want to make the case that there's two huge effects, and we talk about them in our book, Second Machine Age, which we call the bounty and the spread. Let me first talk about the bounty, which is just remarkable. Time for another quick poll. Anybody here have a device that gives them turn-by-turn driving directions? A device that lets them do turn? Oh my God, everybody does. Okay. So of course you all have it because it's built into your smartphones. Whether you have Android or iPhone or whatever, it's basically bundled in. How many people had a device that gave them turn-by-turn driving directions 10 years ago, back in 2004? A couple people, and there's always a couple people. This is a techie audience. So 10 years ago, that was, these GPSs were available, but they were quite expensive. They cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars. They used sophisticated military technology with satellites, and it was kind of cool. It wasn't something that everybody had, but today it is something that everybody has. And that's an example of the bounty, the fact that technology is bringing amazing technologies to us at a much, much lower cost than previously. Another example is this ad from Radio Shack that a friend sent me. This ad is actually back from, I think it's 1994. And the interesting thing is, if you look at it, virtually every single item in that ad that costs hundreds or thousands of dollars is available for free in your smartphone today. So there is, of course, the computer and the calculator. There is an answering machine, if you guys remember what an answering machine was. There is a music player, except, of course, our smartphones have access to far more songs, millions of songs, in a way that wouldn't be available even to an audiophile back then. There's the camera, there's the video camera. So just a whole set of different technologies that are all bundled in more or less for close to nothing once you get the phone, and the costs keep going down and down. And the capabilities in most cases are much better than what they had back in just 20 years ago or so. The other side is an example of some other things that are happening with smartphones. They can help diagnose diseases. This set of screenshots have to do with an app that will help diagnose melanoma and skin cancer by taking pictures and recognizing it. An even more remarkable technology is something called CPath, for computational pathologist. And what it will do is look at cells, breast cancer biopsy cells, and recognize which of them are likely to be cancerous and which ones are not cancerous. They had CPath look at large numbers of both categories, and on its own, CPath saw the patterns and recognized the 7 key markers of breast cancer that they have been training human pathologists. Many of them go to medical school and residencies for years to recognize these. And that's pretty remarkable, but it didn't stop there. They had CPath keep going, and they said, just keep looking, see what else you see. And CPath identified 3 additional markers that weren't in any of the medical literature, that none of the human pathologists had ever recognized before, but CPath noticed 3 additional patterns to look for. And now CPath can do a better job than humans can or could in recognizing those and diagnosing those kinds of diseases. So we're going to have more wealth, and we're going to have longer lives and better medical care because of these advances in the technology. And interestingly, many of these improvements aren't even showing up in the GDP statistics. If you look at all of these goods and services here, they have a couple things in common. One, they all are new just in the past decade or maybe since the year 2000, but also they're all basically free. They're all available at 0 cost once you have access to the internet. And that creates enormous wealth for us, but it doesn't show up in the GDP statistics. GDP, gross domestic product, is a measure of all the goods and services that are bought and sold in the economy. If they have 0 price, then they add 0 to GDP. So when Encyclopedia Britannica is sold, it could add hundreds or thousands of dollars to GDP. When someone accesses Wikipedia, it doesn't move the GDP dial at all. And this leads to a huge underestimate of economic growth, because Wikipedia does have value. In fact, it has far more information in it than Britannica ever had, and more up to date, and roughly about as accurate according to the tests that have been done. So these new goods and services definitely increase our consumer welfare. They make us better off, but they don't show up in our GDP statistics, and our productivity statistics are based directly off the GDP statistics. So if we're underestimating GDP, we're also underestimating our productivity. And work I've done with Ju Hyo, a postdoc here at the MIT Sloan School, we estimate that the value of these goods and services is about $300 billion a year. These are just the free goods and services, the ones that aren't being measured. And that gap is getting larger and larger. We're getting more and more free stuff, like that GPS I mentioned earlier, like the health benefits, and like all those goods and services. So our real well-being is becoming less and less well measured by our official statistics. Just as we're going to have to reinvent our skills and our organizations, we have to reinvent our GDP and our official metrics if we're going to keep track of this digital revolution and get a sense of what's actually happening. But if you just go by the official statistics, you can still get somewhat of a sense of what's happening. And here's what's happening with GDP, investment, profits, and ultimately I'll show you employment in a minute. And there's definitely some good news there. We are at record levels of GDP. We are at record levels of profits, record levels of investment. There are more millionaires, more billionaires than ever before in history. So there's a lot of very encouraging statistics, even with the fact that we're underestimating the true benefit. But you guys also know that not all the statistics have been impressive. There's a reason they call economics the dismal science. Some of them have been pretty dismal. For instance, employment growth. We did yesterday, I just read, we finally came back to the same employment level that we had pre-recession, but that's actually not nearly as encouraging as you might think. We have 15 million more people in the workforce than we did back then, and so it's actually a sign of much lower ratio of employment to population. And that red line tracks what's happened to the employment to population ratio. The unemployment statistics have gotten a little bit better, but the main reason is not because more people are working. The main reason is because more people have dropped out of the labor force and aren't even looking for jobs anymore. Over 800,000 people dropped out of the labor force in the last report previously. You can see that cliff they kind of fall off during the Great Recession. It's been bumping along, barely moving at all since then. And you can see even before the Great Recession, it was subpar. Something weird was happening. We weren't keeping up with the growth of the overall GDP or rest of the economy. Other statistics are also dismal. Median income, that's the income of the person or the family at the 50th percentile, is lower now than it was in the early 1990s. GDP is bigger, overall wealth is bigger, GDP per capita is higher, but median income is lower. How can median income be so much lower if the average income isn't lower? Well, you guys have taken your statistics. You know that the average and the median are two different numbers. You can have a lot of wealth and income created, but if it goes to a small group of people, the person at the 50th percentile doesn't necessarily participate in that. And that's something that we've been seeing happening. So what's going on? How can this be? Well, this was a puzzle in terms of trying to understand this. I'm sort of a technological optimist, as you can kind of tell. I was amazed by these technologies. But I had to confront these statistics. A number of people, Bob Gordon, Tyler Cowen, they said, look at these numbers, Eric. You can't say that the technology is helping everybody. And I tried to understand what was going on. And with Andy, we wrote this book a couple of years ago called Race Against the Machine. And the essential conclusion is in this sentence here. The digital technologies are changing rapidly. They're racing ahead. They're making vast improvements. I do not believe that we've reached the end of innovation or the end of growth, as some people say. But I do believe that our organizations, our skills, our institutions are not keeping pace. That if you have rapid change in technology, but not rapid change in skills and organizations, you can have a mismatch, you can have a gap, and millions of people can be left behind. And so in an ironic, paradoxical way, the reason that so many people are falling behind is actually not because technology is stagnating, but because it's racing ahead without them keeping up in terms of adapting to that. And that's a growing problem. It's getting worse and worse, and it's likely to continue to get worse if we don't do something to address it. And here's some data that drives that home a little bit more sharply. There are four big statistics that economists like me like to track: productivity, employment, median income, and real GDP. And for most of the past century, they kind of grew in lockstep. We don't have great data for the 1800s, but as far as we can tell, they also grew in tandem back then. But since then, they've become decoupled. This is what Andy and I call the great decoupling. And what you see is that productivity is still doing just fine. And real GDP is doing fine. That blue line and the gray line, they haven't slowed down, they haven't stopped. You know, sure, there's little bounces around there. You can see a bit of the Great Recession in there. But by and large, those statistics are still doing all right. What's happened is that median income is not doing as well. And you can adjust for health benefits and taxes and other things. It doesn't really change that line very much. This is the official government statistics. And you can also see that the employment ratio has been doing quite dismally. So we want to understand more what's going on. And the real aha I had when we were working on this book was this point that it's perfectly possible for digital progress to make the pie bigger, yet there's no economic law. There's nothing in any of the textbooks There's nothing in any of the economic papers that says that everybody has to benefit evenly or that everybody has to benefit at all. It's perfectly possible, according to the theory, that you could have growth in the economy but have some people be made absolutely worse off. Now, through most of history, that group that was made worse off was quite small. You know, people who made horseshoes weren't necessarily thrilled when the automobile was introduced. And they were able to adapt and find new things to do. But according to the theory, it's possible for that group to be 10%, 20%, 50%, even 70 or more percent of the economy. And what appears to be happening recently is that group is much larger than it used to be. There's far more jobs being affected. The whole set of routine information processing jobs, which is maybe 60% of the US economy, is right now being quite affected. I'll show you some data in a minute. And many people are not in that group that's benefiting from the technology the way they used to in previous eras. And that, for me, helps me understand this paradox of improving innovation, improving technology, yet many people not being very happy with the state of the economy. I just want to say, there are other things going on as well. There's globalization and offshoring. There are changes in economic policy. But to me, the big force in the background that's transforming the economy is this technological reinvention, the second machine age. Let me give you a little bit of economics refresher about how this can happen. And in particular, I want to explain the concept of biased technical change. Technical change in most of the textbooks, in the beginning textbooks, is like a rising tide that affects the whole economy. But if you go to the later chapters, what you'll see is that it can also be biased technical change. And there are three kinds of biased technical change in the sense that the technology affects one group differently than another group. The first one I want to describe is what economists call skill-biased technical change. Skill-biased technical change is technology that helps more skilled workers at the expense of less skilled workers, or in some cases, middle-skilled workers. And this chart by my MIT colleague David Otter and my other MIT colleague Daron Acemoglu illustrates it really compellingly. So I think this is a chart you can show to your kids if they're trying to decide whether to drop out of college or not. So early in the century, it was a rising tide that lifted all boats. If you had a good education, you did well. But even if you were a high school dropout, you saw your wages going up. Everybody's wages went up. Then there was the oil shock in the 70s. Everyone took a hit. But since then, they've kind of fanned out. They've dispersed. People with a good degree, like from a place like MIT, have done very well. People who've gone to grad school, people who've gone to college. But people who didn't go to college, or even just had some college, have actually seen their wages fall, and they're lower than they were a few years ago. So there's been this huge spreading out, this fanning out compared to where they started. And this is the essence of what's going on with skill-biased technical change. Otter and Acemoglu and dozens of other people have researched it. I wrote a couple papers, one in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and pretty much there's a consensus that the main reason for this is technology. Technology has automated a lot of middle-skilled jobs, a lot of low-skilled jobs. It tends to augment or complement jobs that require more education. And right now, although some people say that going to college isn't worth it, the reality is that the gap is larger than it's ever been in history. And it's not just high skill versus low skill. If you dive in a little deeper, it's interesting. It turns out that the middle skill jobs have been hit the hardest. Otter and Dorn, two other researchers, ranked all the skills, all the jobs on a rank from 0 to 100 in terms of their wages and their skill requirements. And whether you look at employment or look at wages, you see a very similar U-shaped pattern. People at the high end have done well, wages have gone up, and people at the low end have also actually, interestingly, not done too terribly. Those are jobs that might require physical skills, you know, like a gardener or a cook or a barber or a janitor. They're not necessarily the highest paid jobs, but they require some physical dexterity. And so far, machines have not been able to do those very well. You know, I showed you Baxter, but I really wouldn't want Baxter cutting my hair anytime soon. So those jobs haven't been affected as much by technology. The ones in the middle have been hit the hardest. What are those jobs? Those are things like clerks, bookkeepers, accountants, secretaries, a lot of middle management jobs. And that's a big chunk of the economy. Those have been the easiest to automate by the current wave of technology. Otter and Doran call them routine information processing jobs. That's what we use that same term in our book, The Second Machine Age. And the demand for those kinds of jobs had fallen. And again, the conclusion of the academic literature is that the main reason for that is technology. At least 75% of the drop in those jobs has been because of the way technology has affected those jobs relative to other jobs. So that's the first category, skill-biased technical change. The second one I'll talk about is capital versus labor. There's a French economist, Thomas Piketty, who has a best-selling book about capital, and he very much emphasizes this particular trade-off between capital and labor. But he only spent 2 years at MIT, so I don't think he fully absorbed the importance of technology. So I'm going to emphasize that a little bit more. He talks about savings and accumulation, but I think he misses the really bigger story, which is the role of technology in shifting the capital-labor ratio. Now, capital and labor have, for centuries, been considered the two big inputs since Adam Smith and Karl Marx talked about capitalism. And you can plot the share of GDP that goes to capital and labor. So what you see here is that they kind of bounce around, but for most of the time, they didn't really change too much. In fact, there's something called the Kaldor Facts, which basically claimed that capital and labor ratios just stayed constant all through history. And that was true up until about the year 2000 or so. Since then, they have departed quite a bit. The share of GDP going to labor has been plummeting. Through the recession, before the recession, after the recession, the share going to capital is at an all-time high. So this ratio is changing. And if you think about it, it's kind of, you can see why that would happen. Take a factory like Foxconn's factory. Terry Gao runs that, and he has pledged to take 1 million of his workers and replace them with 1 million robots. And supposedly he's already bought 100,000 robots on that track. He sometimes talks a big game, and I don't know if he's actually going to do that, but that's the path that he's trying to do. He's certainly trying to get better bargaining leverage by doing that. If he does that, he may be able to produce more output in his factory. Maybe his profits will go up, more efficiency, make the iPhone 6 a little bit more effectively. But it's also going to have effects on the capital-labor ratio. More of the costs, more of the revenues are going to go to capital and less to labor. And capital owners and labor workers are not the same people. They're different groups, so it's going to rearrange income in the economy. And that's sort of a microcosm of what's happening in lots of places. Apple has decided to build its next factory for the Mac Pro in what low-wage country? US, Texas, Austin, Texas. Why are they doing it? It's actually not because it's low wage. The wages are high there. It's because wages are increasingly irrelevant. It's a highly automated factory. It doesn't matter what the wages are. They want to be close to market. They want to be close to engineers. The share of the costs that go to labor is so small that that isn't a significant factor in their decision. The third group is perhaps the most important one. It's superstars versus everyone else. And this one has been, I think, especially striking, although it hasn't been written about as much in the economic literature, at least not yet. I'm going to try and fix that with some papers we have coming out. But there are superstars, rock stars in media where you see this especially. This is our friend Lady Gaga. She is not an MIT alumnus. Alumna. But she is an example of a phenomenon, which is that it used to be that a rock singer, an artist, a musician, an actor could reach a playhouse full of people. But with a series of technologies over the 20th century, they can reach much broader groups. And with digital technologies, they can reach billions of people. We recently had our first ever billionaire author, a writer who made over $1 billion, J.K. Rowling, with her Harry Potter books, but also multimedia, movies, etc., video games, has reached that milestone. And that's because digitization allows you to replicate talent, replicate luck, or whatever it is that Lady Gaga has. But it's not just music and media. It's also software in other areas. This is Scott Cook. He's a billionaire. And he owns Intuit, which, among other things, makes TurboTax. Let's think a little bit about how TurboTax works. TurboTax is a program, piece of software that's taken the tax preparation process and codified it. Here are all the steps. Once you codify it, you can digitize it. And once you digitize it, you can make a copy of it. You can make 10 copies. You can make 100 million copies or 1 billion copies of it. Each of those copies has 3 interesting characteristics. First off, they can be made for almost 0 cost. They're almost free. Secondly, each of those copies is a perfect replica of the original. It's exactly the same. It's not close. It's exactly the same, bit by bit. And thirdly, each of those copies can be shared or transmitted anywhere in the country, anywhere on the planet, almost instantaneously. Free, perfect, instant. Those are 3 characteristics that we didn't use to describe most goods and services for most of history. But they are routine characteristics of anything that's digital. And they lead to some weird and wonderful economics. They lead to bounty, the fact that we can now have access to that good and many others for very low cost, whether it's $39 or free for a lot of the software. So that's great. They also lead to winner-take-all markets. When you have digital goods that are free, perfect, and instant, you don't need hundreds of thousands of human tax preparers, each serving a small piece of the market, a few customers. You can have one or a handful of companies to serve the entire market because there aren't really any capacity constraints, right? Economics, think back to your microeconomics classes. So this is a very different kind of economic system where you have these winner-take-all markets, and you tend to sometimes have niche providers that fill in other parts of it. So winner-take-all is a little bit too simple. It's more like winner-take-most or power law economics. You get this kind of long tail where there's a small group of companies or individuals that win a big share of the market, and then there's a longer tail filling in different niches of it. But it's not the typical kind of bell curve or normal distribution that you see for other types of goods and services where there's a mass in the middle and a few at the extremes. This is much more of a power law. Well, that's software. But you know, Mark Andreessen had it exactly right when he said that software is eating the world. And what he meant by that is that these digital economics are not just in music and media and software, they're also coming to retailing. You see that there. Manufacturing, finance. Really, every good and every service is increasingly having digitization at its core. Every industry is becoming a digital industry. And that means that the economics I just described are increasingly important in every industry. You see it in retailing and manufacturing and elsewhere. So what we're seeing, these kind of superstar economics, it's not just for these two, it's coming to more and more of the economy. That's the theory, a couple of examples, but I want to give you the data as well. Here's a chart that Thomas Piketty, the French economist, published, and it's really quite striking. This is not the 1% that everyone talks about. This is the 1% of the 1%, the 0.01%. And what you see is that they are at a record share of income in the United States, and similar patterns are true in just about every country in the world. It's true in all the OECD countries, and it's true in the developing countries, with one or two exceptions. But by and large, this is a pattern that's not because of particular tax policy or government or social or culture. It's something you see quite widespread. It's more or less extreme in different countries, but the overall shape is broadly similar. And I think it reflects very much these underlying technological forces that are affecting the entire planet. So what is to be done? And now I want you guys to start thinking. We've got a little bit of time left here. I want you to think about what we can do going forward, how we can embrace some of the opportunities, boost the bounty, but also manage the challenges that we're facing. Because if we have a society where not everyone's participating, I think a lot of people are going to get angry, whether it's the Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street or other people. I think there's a sense that a lot of people have that they're not participating as much as they expected in this bounty. And they're right. I don't think that they have the right diagnosis. I think that it's not necessarily corrupt people on Wall Street or in Washington. There's plenty of those, but that's not the big force that's changing the economy. I think the bigger force are these underlying technological changes, and we need to think about that. So let me tell you a little story. I talked about different kinds of problems that machines could do well. Maybe one of the turning points of the second machine age was back in 1997 when a machine, Deep Blue, beat a human in the game of chess. Garry Kasparov, the world chess champion, lost in chess. And actually for a long time, chess used to be the example of the intellectual mastery of humans. And now we don't really think of it that way because machines can do that. But that required a huge supercomputer to beat Garry Kasparov. Today, it turns out that you could put a chess program on a cell phone, and people have done this, enter it into a tournament, and it will beat most human grandmasters, okay? So it's advanced quite a bit. It got so bad that a couple years ago, they asked the Dutch grandmaster, Jan Donner, what strategy would you use to defeat a computer chess program? And Jan Donner kind of thought for a moment, rubbed his chin, and then he smiled. He said, I would bring a hammer. Whoops. So that is a strategy I think a lot of people are thinking may be the way to address this. I don't want to encourage that. I think that the technology is creating so much bounty that we should not try to stop the technology. We should not eliminate it. And in fact, Garry Kasparov, Jan's competitor and colleague, I think has a better idea. After Garry lost, he created a new kind of chess called advanced chess or freestyle chess. And it turns out that today, a machine is no longer the world chess champion. Neither is a human. The best chess player in the world is a team of humans and computers working together. In advanced chess or freestyle chess, you are allowed to have the human and computer cooperate. That would be considered cheating in the old human tournaments. It would be considered cheating in a computer chess tournament. But in freestyle chess, that's the whole point. And it's really remarkable. If you look at the winner of the freestyle chess tournament, it turns out that that team does not have the most powerful supercomputer, the best technology. It turns out that it doesn't have the best grandmasters, the highest rated chess players. So what does that team have? It has a group of people who have figured out how to coordinate, how to work as a team, how to divide the problem up so that they can outcompete the machine or the human experts. I think there's a lesson there that we should learn how to not race against machines and try to beat them head to head, but use the machines, work with them to amplify our own strengths and compensate for our own weaknesses. Because humans and machines still have big differences, and we can talk more in the Q&A about what some of those differences are. But by working as a team, we can do things we never could have before. So I want to put a new grand challenge to you, and let's talk about this. The old grand challenge, the DARPA grand challenge, made the self-driving car. It made the Atlas robot that's doing a bunch of different tasks. And when I hang out with the guys at CSAIL and elsewhere, technologists, it's very striking to me how energized they get by working on this contest. They work nights and weekends. One of them never finished his dissertation because he spent all his time working on the grand challenge. It's a very energizing kind of a project. But I would say the technologists are doing just fine. It's great that they're doing that and creating these wonderful technologies, but that's not where I see the bottleneck. I see it actually that those of us in management, at the Sloan School of Management and elsewhere, we aren't doing our half of the bargain. We need to step up because digital technologies will continue to accelerate, but it's our skills, our organizations, and our institutions that are lagging. It's us. We need to step up to keep up with those technologists, and we're not doing a very good job of it. We have to reinvent all of those. We have to reinvent our education. We have to come up with new models of entrepreneurship and business creation, new business models. Sure, we're doing some of that, but the data say we're not doing it fast enough. And if we just do business as usual, that won't solve the problem. If we just sit back and say, well, we'll keep our same old approaches and let the technology evolve, manifestly, that's not working well. It's not creating the kind of shared prosperity that I think we want to see. So I think we need to reinvent our economy. We need to reinvent our society. We need to reinvent our business models and organizations. We need to think of better ways of updating our skills to keep up with accelerating technology. If we do that, I think we're going to be able to not only boost the bounty, but but also manage it in a way that a lot of people participate more broadly. So let me describe that we've got this initiative on the digital economy at MIT that's squarely going after that question. We're bringing together some of the best minds at MIT, but elsewhere as well, in economics, Media Lab, CSAIL, and of course, centered at the Sloan School. We've got teams of students that are working on these issues, and I would welcome any of you in this room who want to help out in different ways to make that more of a success. Now let's start right now. Let's hear from you about the challenges and opportunities that you see and what your concerns and questions are. So why don't I pause there for the formal part of the talk and ask if there are any questions or comments that any of you have about the second machine age and how it's affecting the economy. So I guess why don't we go right over. Okay, here's someone.
Most of our technology is focused
You know
on...
what might be good is why don't you identify yourself so we all kind of know who you are.
I'm Marty Greenfield, class 51,
Yep.
course 15. Most of our technology is focused on exploiting just two of our senses, audio and visual.
Right.
We have three others, notably touch, which is almost unused. When are we going to start going after that, and what impact is that going to have on improving us?
Well, that's a very exciting frontier, improving all of our senses, and you're absolutely right. The biggest breakthroughs I've seen are in vision systems, where we used to not be able to recognize objects to being able to understand them, and in hearing, like understanding speech. But there are teams, especially my friends at the Media Lab, I think have done a lot of work on this. There's an absolutely compelling video, if you haven't seen it yet, by my colleague Hugh Hare of the Media Lab, describing bionic limbs and sensors that can allow people to walk around and manipulate the world and to sense what's happening there. I haven't heard as much about other senses, smell and taste. I don't know, maybe people are working on those. But if you put them all together, you start being able to do things that previously only humans could do. But I also want to suggest that I want to reframe the question a little bit. You know, if we look at what humans can do and then try to make machines match up to them one-to-one, implicitly what we're doing is creating machines that are better and better substitutes for humans, which is an interesting way of framing the problem. And whenever I talk to the guys at the AI, they just can't help but thinking about it that way. But I'd like to have you think about it in different ways. What can machines do that humans can't do that's totally different? Let's not try to just match what humans do. Let's have machines do very different things. So, you know, radar and LiDAR and other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum are things that machines potentially could sense, X-rays. There are a whole set of other kinds of capabilities that machines have strengths in. And so, yes, we can look at the particular senses that humans have and match them, but ultimately, in terms of expanding the space of problems that we can solve, I think we're going to have more success if we think about totally different areas, senses that none of us have, and add those, augment those going forward. And then when you combine those with humans, you're able to solve more problems. It also has the nice side effect that instead of replacing humans and making them less necessary, it continues to have humans have a way to add value. Let's take another question. Are there any microphones on this side? Yeah, so we'll go back and forth. How about over here, if you can get the mic to him?
Hi, Eric. I'm Brooks Spalding. I was a Sloan class in 91.
Yes, just like me.
Fun to be here. Yeah.
We got a few of the 91ers here.
Go 91, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that illustrated, I think, the human computer maybe working as complements or pairs, when you go back to Jeopardy, one part of Jeopardy you didn't talk about is, what do you wager?
Yes.
What do you put down to answer?
Right.
And if computers go just with the expected value and they're not risk averse, they could come up maybe really trouncing the humans.
Right.
On the other hand, the humans could bring the insight. And how do you balance the human ability to measure and gauge risk with the computer's inability and come out with a win-win without the world blowing up?
Okay, I was with you until that last sentence there, got me a little scared. But I think you make a good point that humans are great. I mean, machines are great at doing the expected value calculations. You know, chess, poker has turned out to be much harder because of bluffing and other things. I guess I'm a little bit of a science fiction fan, so I can't help but think of that classic Star Trek episode where Spock tells Kirk that, you know, I've done all the calculations and we're trapped. There's nothing we can do. You know, they have a winning position. And Kirk says, no, it's not chess, it's poker, and we're going to bluff them. And so he, of course, saves the day with his human ingenuity. But right now, that is something that's much harder, the psychology, the strategic aspects. But I also would say never, that machines are picking up on some of those things. And when I talk to some of the guys working in AI and game theory, they are trying to develop probabilistic models that take into account strategic interactions. Humans can behave in very unpredictable and even irrational ways, but ultimately there are some patterns in that. And my colleague Sandy Pentland, who's working on the initiative on digital economy with me, has this terrific book called Social Physics, which kind of susses out the underlying patterns from large groups of people. It may be hard to predict any single individual, but if you, by the law of large numbers, get enough of them, you can see patterns that wouldn't be apparent to any single individual. So it's definitely an important frontier of where we're going. Actually, I should touch on the last part of your question about without the world blowing up. I think that is actually not something that should be ignored. And we talk about a little bit at the end of the book, that there are some, as you get more and more power to change the world, you can make the world much, much better, but also we're putting more and more power in the hands of very small groups of people, like even individuals. And we know some of those individuals are nuts, and some of them have evil intentions. And it used to be like a person who was really angry, had a spear and could like maybe hurt one other person. Then we had technologies, machine guns, atom bombs that could affect thousands or millions of people. And new technologies, self-replicating artificial intelligence, nanobots, DNA, viruses, they could affect much larger groups. They could affect billions of people. And we have to start thinking about some of these existential risks. I'm not saying it's going to happen right away, but probably we should devote a portion of our R&D and our thinking to safeguards. We had a little game that I played with my MBA students. It was like it was like 15 years ago, where instead of just building kind of an eBay where people would post prices, they could post algorithms. And so if you were selling, a bottle of water, you could say, price it at X, but look around and see if anyone else is selling the same thing. And if they are, price it 1 penny less than that. So you'd kind of try to win the market. Bertrand competition. You guys remember that phrase? So that was cool. It had this little algorithm. And what the person didn't count on was that somebody else had come up with the exact same algorithm. So what happened? And where'd the price go? I wish. It didn't go to 0. It was a lot worse than that. Negative infinity. So luckily we didn't enforce that contract. They didn't have to pay the other person all the money in the world in order to take the bottle off their hands. But you can see, even like the simplest little, like that's a trivial little thing. I mean, that like 5 lines of code or something, and you end up having these interactions with other people. There was the flash crash. This happens for real. This is not just hypothetical. And it doesn't just happen in financial markets. You can imagine happening in electricity markets, in nuclear power regulation. You could imagine all sorts of weird life support systems being affected. And we don't always know exactly how they're going to interact with another. So it's something that I'm beginning to pay more attention to. There's a physics professor here, Max Tegmark, who is putting more energy into it. It's not a big part of our book, but it's something I'm beginning to pay a little more attention to. So let's take another question. I guess the middle section hasn't gone yet. So how about in the back? Back over there? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Barry Jacobson, class 84. The problem that I'm hearing that I haven't heard you directly address is that it seems like all the goods and services that we need could be produced without everyone having jobs.
Right.
And that seems like the fundamental problem.
Yeah, well, let me talk about that.
Address.
Is it a problem or is it an opportunity? And let me, because it's kind of a sad thing that we think of it as a problem. But what you're talking about is a world where we have abundant goods and services without having to do as much work. That should be a dream come true. You think about it, right? It's something that people talked about for millennia, having robot slaves that do all the work, and then we sit in luxury. The reason it's a problem is that our system right now is set up that if you aren't don't have a job, that's the main way for the past about 200 years that people earned money, working for somebody else in a job and getting paid for that. And that's sort of the engine that drove our system going forward. I can think of the answers in the short term and in the long term. Actually, let me briefly talk about the long term. If we truly do go to a Star Trek economy, like you described, where the replicator, if we say Earl Grey hot, it produces tea for us. More Star Trek references in this than I expected, but that actually, I think we'll probably be okay, because then we can have an abundance economy. We can spend our time on literature and poetry and video games or whatever it is that we enjoy doing, and machines will produce stuff at close to zero cost. In between, though, we have potentially a very, very rough transition where a lot of people aren't able to participate, and entrepreneurs aren't creative enough to think of something useful for them to do. And ultimately, I think there's three answers to that. The first is we have to totally reinvent education so that people have more of the skills that contribute to the society. There are a lot of things that people can do better than machines. They mostly are in the areas of creativity and interpersonal areas. These are things that our current school system doesn't enhance, arguably tries to crush. If you look at a 3 or 4-year-old, they love building things, creating things. And somehow our schools say, no, please sit quietly, don't think outside the box. And that's not what we want in our next economy. So we need to reinvent it. Technology can help, whether it's Khan Academy, edX, and MITx, other technologies that give people access to learning new things they couldn't have. We need to embrace creativity. And I wouldn't say it's just, highfalutin thinking of new ideas. It's also just interacting with people, something that we're very good at. Most of us wouldn't think that a robot coach would give a very effective halftime speech to a team. Humans are better at that kind of motivation. Sales, negotiation, nurturing, caring for people. There are lots of jobs. There are millions of potential jobs in those areas. So that's something we can work on, is reskilling people. The second big category, I would say, and we talk about this in the book, is entrepreneurship. We need to be more creative about not just thinking how to use technology to eliminate costs and take an existing good or service and do it more cheaply, but create new goods and services. Most of the people used to work in agriculture. Now it's less than 2%. Those people didn't just become unemployed. It wasn't this big disaster. It was great because entrepreneurs figured out ways to redeploy them. Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, other people came up with entirely new industries that Thomas Jefferson would never have thought of. We need to think of other new industries that I can't think of. I'm an MIT professor, but I can't think of what all those are going forward. And we're not doing it fast enough. The data say that sure, there's a buzz about entrepreneurship, but we are not creating the new goods and services fast enough. Ultimately, that's not so much the job of MIT professors, thankfully. It's not necessarily the job of people in Washington or government people. We have a category of people who are in charge of thinking of new goods and services. We call them entrepreneurs. And we need to do what we can to foster them so they can invent some of these new goods and services going forward. Not because everyone who gets unemployed is now going to hang out a shingle and become an entrepreneur, but because the entrepreneurs are going to try to think of things for them to do that create value. And the third thing I think we have to seriously think about is income distribution and how we organize the wealth of society. As we get closer and closer to that, I think, nirvana that you described, we are going to have more wealth. We're going to have more room to be able to pay for basic things that were too expensive to pay for before. Some people talk about a basic income, which is basically like a floor on what people have. Milton Friedman was among the advocates of a negative income tax and basic income, that noted socialist. But there's a variant that we focus more on in the book, which is a negative income tax and a kind of an earned income tax credit that supplements people who have low wages. And in ways, it's a little bit like the minimum wage, except that instead of penalizing employers and saying you have to pay the higher wage, it has all of us contribute to that. And it subsidizes the people who are working and encourages more work while also redistributing income. I think some combination of those three things, radically reinventing education, not just spending more on it, although that wouldn't hurt, but radically reinventing it, boosting entrepreneurship so we speed up the creation, not slow down technology, but speed up the adaptation. And thirdly, rethinking our tax policy and incomes. Over time, that can help smooth that transition. But it's a really serious problem. I think in some ways there's been a failure of imagination and creativity in thinking about how we address that problem. And a big part of this initiative on the digital economy, and if you want to go to this website here, the second one, digital.mit.edu/IDE, you can learn more about what we're doing to try to reinvent and think about this going forward, because I do think it's going to be the big defining challenge of us going forward to make sure that more people don't get left behind, and therefore more people don't get angry, don't have as many people throwing rocks at Google buses, and instead trying to think of how we can create value with these new technologies. I think we have time for one or two more questions, depending on if I can be less long-winded. How about someone near the front? How about right up here, one of these two? You pick one. Okay.
I'm Joe Wyatt, class of '62, and I want to make 2 points. One is I'm a high school teacher. I teach high school physics, and I teach it like a MIT course at that level. Great. And I'm the most successful teacher in the school, and I'm the most vilified. And my point is that what I'm doing is programming a human brain. Mm-hmm. And I can see it right now. I am to build the basic skills of the human so he can interact with the machine.
Yes.
That's what's missing. And in the educational system, we're trying to use technology to do that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure my experience is that's probably not going to be successful until that basic level of human thinking. I have this saying is that everything of great importance, not everything, but great importance of anything you learn is with an intimate conversation with another human being. Mm-hmm. And then once you prepare that person, then you can have the end. The other one is what happens when the machine interface breaks down. I'm a pilot.
Yeah.
I once went flying. Now, I learned without GPS, without anything. I learned with a map, like stopwatch and all this other stuff. And so I took a flight. Mm-hmm. And the GPS didn't fail, but it failed just enough that I got lost. Mm-hmm. And so I'm where I'm supposed to be. Mm-hmm. I think I'm where I'm supposed to be, but I can't recognize anything around me. Mm-hmm. In the back of my mind is I only got so much gasoline, and I'm 5,000 feet in the air.
That'll concentrate.
And so I fell back pulled out my map, and started doing the complex process of trying to figure out without any electronic aids. And I finally figured out where I was, and then I went to where I was supposed to go and landed. So I think there's two problems. How do you program the human brain with the basic skills, thinking skills, to be able to interact with the machine? And what happens when the machine interface fails and the human is in great risk because now he's got to take the whole load?
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you for doing what you're doing. I wish more people would contribute their skills in that way. And I agree very much that the technology could be used in an effective way or an ineffective way. And I think too often people take technology and they use it to create rote lessons plans and say, and the mentality is, let's stuff more and more facts into this brain. And that's not what we need for the 21st century. That's not what we need for the second machine age. We need people to do what you're saying, to be able to have a conversation, to think creatively, to be able to do things, not just regurgitate facts, but be able to do problem solving. And part of the strength that humans have is those interpersonal skills that you just described. Motivating people. It's one thing to plop a kid in front of Khan Academy or whatever and expect them to just plow ahead. It's another thing, and maybe there's a couple kids who will do that, but let's face it, most kids aren't like that. And having a human who can know how to motivate people, push the right buttons, see when they're struggling, guide them the right way, that's a huge, huge value. And we haven't yet, I don't think we've quite cracked how to use these technologies effectively. MOOCs, edX, MITx, there's an opportunity there, but I wouldn't say that we've really solved it yet. One of the biggest values is not just being able to put all that content and data out there, although that's great, like I showed you with the economics of digitization. There's another aspect of it that perhaps is even more important, which is that when you digitize something, you datafy it. It means you can measure it more effectively. And data and measurement is the lifeblood of science and progress. So if we start being able to see what's working and what's not working, we can improve it. And you see that in the scientific disciplines, it's all about better measurement. A microscope revolutionized biology and medicine. In education, we could potentially learn much better what's working, what's not working. I'm not talking about having a standardized test at the end, but I'm talking about continuously monitoring where people are struggling, where they're having success. Anant Agrawal, who runs edX, describes, I don't have time to go into complete depth, but basically describes how they were able to learn so much from those courses about which learning styles worked and which didn't. I mean, to give you one small example, they prepared these lectures and then gave them problem sets afterwards. But with edX, the data, they were able to see how people actually used it. And it turned out, to his initial disappointment, that most people didn't look at the lectures before they dove into the problem sets. The typical user went in and tried to struggle with the problem set, and then they went back to parts of the lecture to try to figure out how to solve things. And it was a good insight for him because he realized, okay, that's the way people really think. When they want to have a problem that they're trying to solve and then use the data to bring it in. So they reinvented the course to fit better with the learning style. And of course, different people had different styles. You can customize it. So there's a lot you can do when you have enough data to not just raise the level of education, but more importantly, improve the slope, have continuous learning. I could go on that. There's a lot we can do with reinventing, and at the Sloan School and MIT more broadly, I think we're leading a lot of these sorts of changes. But we're about out of time, so let me just leave you with a closing thought here, that this is not the first time that technology has revolutionized the economy or revolutionized management. One that I've studied in some depth is the electrification of American factories. And it's quite striking. If you look at the way American factories were electrified, starting in around the 1890s, it took about 30 years before you saw significant productivity improvement that showed up in the economic data. 30 years. Well, that turns out to be long enough for a generation of managers to retire. And that's not a coincidence. You go back and look at the factories. In the 1890s, most of the factories were driven by water wheels, steam engines, and because of the way the physics worked, you tended to have a really big power source in the middle, and then you had equipment and machinery hooked up to the power source. And you couldn't have them too far away because the pulley and crankshaft that drove it, if you had it too far, the torsion would break it. So you had to have the equipment clustered in close. The stuff that used more power was in closer. They were pretty clever. They didn't just put it in 2 dimensions, they put it in 3 dimensions. They put some stuff above it and below it. So you had these multi-story factories with gears and crankshafts all spinning, some of them here in Kendall Square. Dirty, dark, dangerous factories. Then they electrified them. So what did the electrified factories look like? Well, they retrofitted the factories, they took out the big steam engine, and they went and got the biggest electric motor they could find. They put it in the middle of the factory, hooked up the pulleys and crankshafts, flicked the on switch, and they were back in business. Did that boost productivity? No, hardly made a dent in it. Maybe a little less smoke, I don't know. But it fundamentally didn't really change the factory. Okay, fair enough, they were retrofitting factories. They started building totally new factories from scratch. What did the new factories look like? It turned out they looked just like the old factories. They got a blueprint, some MIT industrial engineer perhaps, or some engineer came in, they made a big X through the steam engine, and they wrote in the margin, put electric motor here instead, and they handed it off. They built the factory from the ground up, multi-story factory, electric motor in the middle, pulleys and crankshafts. Did that boost productivity? No, hardly made a difference. Finally, after about 20, 30 years, you started seeing a very different kind of factory. The new kind of factory, actually similar to what we see today, which were laid out on a single story, often multi-acre factory. And instead of having one big power source in the middle, every single piece of equipment had its own separate electric motors. Some of them bigger, some of them smaller. Electric motors are totally scalable. You can make them tiny, you can make them medium, you can make them big. And the layout of the equipment, was it based on the ones that needed more power being closer to the power outlet and the ones that needed less power further away from the power outlet? No. I mean, let's face it, electricity, you can transmit long distances, not like a crankshaft. If you want to, you can have a big electric motor far from the outlet or whatever. So they didn't have to worry about power consumption and distance the way they did before. So what logic did they use to lay out all that equipment? The assembly line, the basic workflow, the order of materials. So things would come in on one side and work their way across the factory, and that was the arrangement of the machines. A totally different way of setting up a factory. Did that boost productivity? Oh yeah, you bet. Productivity soared. It doubled or tripled according to research by Paul David and others who studied these factories. A huge transformation in American productivity that really took off. But the lesson is that it took a generation to make that transition. The technology was available, it was amazing, but the management, the rethinking of how we organize work didn't change nearly as fast, and that's why we wasted 30 years not really taking full advantage of this technology. I think we're in a similar era where technology is transforming the world, and now actually productivity is, as I showed you, growing quite rapidly. I don't think that's because, or just because today's technologies are so amazing. It's not like they're that much more powerful than electricity, which, let's face it, electricity is pretty cool. But what's different today is that I think we're being much more scientific. We're being much more systematic. 100 years ago, the Sloan School of Management, or I should say that course 15, was introduced at MIT. And we are now systematically thinking about industrial engineering, about management, about business processes, about incentives, about culture, about all those factors that go along with technology. So I guess I want to thank and salute all of you for taking the time to learn about some of these things and for working in your businesses and organizations to make this transition a more effective, faster, and create shared prosperity with these technologies. Thanks very much.